Hey everyone, so I'm back with my Yu-Gi-Oh! Horror Stories, Part 3, which is the last part in this series for now. I was originally going to tell these stories in Part 2, but the video would have been way too long, and I wanted to take the time and dedicate the full attention that these next two stories deserve, especially since they are by far the stories that are the most personal and the most impactful to me. If you haven't seen Parts 1 and 2, feel free to watch them, like them, comment on them, and feel free to do the same for this video. And if you enjoyed this series, feel free to check out my other videos and subscribe if you want. But without any further ado, let's get back into some horror stories. This next story goes way back to the summer school before I was in 2nd grade. So Yu-Gi-Oh! Had been around for a bit, and it was unbelievably popular amongst my classmates. And it was just a popular game in general at this point. So, naturally a bunch of my classmates brought their cards to school so that they could have matches together. And I never personally brought my cards to school since I didn't want to risk losing them, but eventually I did bring them since I finally managed to get 3 Blue Eyes White Dragons from the starter deck Seto Kaiba. And I wanted to prove to my friend that I had 3 Blue Eyes since he didn't believe me. So, I met up with my friend just before school started, and I showed him the 3 Blue Eyes White Dragons that I had, along with the rest of my cards. Blown away, he also took out his cards, and we both had a great time seeing all the different cards that each of us had. Anyways, the bell rang, and I put all my cards back in my backpack, and we headed off to class. So we head over to our classroom, and I take off my backpack, since we had to hang our backpacks on the rack before we entered the class. I don't know why, but those were just the rules. Anyways, as I was carrying my backpack towards the rack, I see this one kid in my class who I recognized from 1st grade. And basically, he was known for being a troublemaker. And worst of all, he was also a known thief. He was also known for giving people a hard time just in general. And I was no exception, since he frequently hassled me the previous year. And hoping he would ignore me, I tried avoiding him, but he unfortunately saw me as he also was making his way towards the racks. He then intentionally bumped into me as he normally did with other people he hassled. So, he bumped into me, and while I was holding my backpack close to my chest, we collided, and he said, "You have Yu-Gi-Oh cards," as he said with a pleasantly surprised look on his face. My guess is he felt the deck boxes when we crashed into each other, but I still don't know how he specifically pinpointed that I had Yu-Gi-Oh cards in my backpack. Trying to mix him up, I told him that I didn't know what he meant as I put my bag on the rack, but we had a bit of a stare down because of this weird exchange, and the look on his face made it clear that he didn't believe my bluff. I told him I was serious and he needed to back off. Undeterred by me, he walked into the class with his friend, who was basically his partner in crime, and he suspiciously looked back at me. After our exchange, I go back to my desk while being weary of his potential intents. So, eventually our class lines up for recess, and we walk out with our teacher to the playground, and after our teacher leaves us to our own devices, I look around to see if the same guy who bothered me was around. However, he was nowhere to be found. I figured he must have skulked off as soon as the teacher left, and I immediately ran over to the racks where I hung our backpacks. As I approach the racks, I don't see the guy or his friend anywhere, so I thought that maybe I beat him to it. I quickly open my backpack, and I see that almost all my cards are gone, and I notice that 2 of my 3 Blue Eyes White Dragons were missing. I obviously knew who the perpetrator was, and I looked for him. I eventually found the guy and his friend right by the handball courts, and I noticed that he and his friend had huge clumps of cards bulging from their pockets. So I go up to his friend while they're not looking since he's the closest to me, and I take the cards from his friend's pockets. His hands clamped down on his pockets, but I managed to pick both of the friend's pockets while he couldn't get me. He turns around while I ask him why he stole my cards, as I look through the cards I salvaged. The friend approaches me and he attempts to take the cards back. The other guy, the initial one, also joins in, and basically all three of us are struggling to keep hold of my cards. I eventually shake them off while trying not to attract the attention of the playground TAs. And after I shake them off, his friend angrily looks at me, and I tell the guy who had the rest of my cards, give me back the rest of my cards, since he still had 2 stacks of the cards in his pocket. And he basically lied and he said those were his cards. So I call him out on his bluff by showing him one of the Blue Eyes White Dragons in the stack of cards that I recovered. I showed him a few more of the rare foil cards that I remember pulling from the packs, just to make my case. And I told them that I was onto their plan, and that they were probably seeking to take one Blue Eyes White Dragon each for themselves, and being that they were caught red-handed, they angrily scrunched their faces, and the first guy said, "So, what are you going to do about it?" As they slowly walked away, I was livid and I realized that he's right, and that there was nothing else I could do. Anyways, I go about the rest of my day, and as the day eventually ends, I walk out of class and I hear the same guy who stole my cards yelling at me. So I turned around and he mockingly waves the one Blue Eyes White Dragon that he managed to successfully steal from me. Completely pissed, I cut my losses and I find solace that at least I managed to recover a few of my cards. Though this guy was a really unsavory character, and this is probably one of the roughest instances that I've ever had with a Yu-Gi-Oh player. It took me a while to get over it, since I can't help but wonder whatever may have happened to those cards that he stole, especially my last Blue Eyes White Dragon. This story is just so messed up, and although it's not as wild or as crazy as the others, the person involved in this situation was unbelievably manipulative. So, this next situation takes place on a school bus, and to provide some context, I went to a different school for 2nd grade, while my original school was undergoing renovations. But since our parents were so familiar with the original school's location, we had a school bus drop us off at the original school so that it could help some parents out who had limited forms of travel. So, the situation takes place when the school day ends, and I'm waiting for some friends to catch up with me before we go onto the school bus. And finally, we all meet up at the line where the school bus is, and we get ourselves situated on the bus. And so, the bus starts to leave for the school campus, the other school campus, that is. So, my friends and I were sitting on the same side of the bus, and we decide to pass the time by looking at each other's Yu-Gi-Oh cards. So we do that, and we get excited whenever we see a card that the other didn't have, and we inevitably start reading off some of the Yu-Gi-Oh card names and some of the effects, until this one kid says, "Hey," as he looks over from the seat in front of us, and he asks us what kind of Yu-Gi-Oh cards we have. I naturally show him a few of my cards, until one catches his eye. The card was called Banisher of the Light, and I show it to him and he asks if he could have it. I told him I would trade or sell for it, but he said he didn't have anything to really trade or sell. And it's at this point where he becomes angry. He tells me that I could either give him the card or he could go to the teacher at the front of the bus and tell her that I have Yu-Gi-Oh cards, which would mean that I would get in trouble and lose all of my cards. And it also meant that I was cornered in an awful position. Keep in mind, this kid was a 4th grader, while I was in 2nd grade at the time. And if you could go back and remember your 2nd grade years, you might remember how you looked up to the 4th and 5th graders, since they seemed so cool and almost like role models that you wanted to be like. This added to the situation, which made me feel worse, and I sat there kind of horrified alongside my friends. And I looked at my 2 friends, and we didn't know what else to do, so I reluctantly gave him the card, to which he smirked, he grabbed it, and then he quickly retreated back to sitting in the seat. Feeling shattered that I just had one of my Yu-Gi-Oh cards extorted from me, I figured that it was better than me losing all of my cards. But what added to the mind game was that if he busted me, he could also tell the teacher that my friends had Yu-Gi-Oh cards too, which would likely lead the teachers to confiscate their cards, and we would all get in trouble. And this 4th grader knew that. That was the mind game he was playing. So luckily he kept to his word and he didn't tell. And we arrive at the pickup station where my grandma would pick me up, and I was feeling terrible after this whole experience. My grandma kinda noticed how down I looked, but I told her I was just tired from the day. But in reality, as the song goes, I was 1 card short because a mean-spirited and manipulative 4th grader on the school bus managed to take one of my cards away. So yeah, these have been my Yu-Gi-Oh horror stories, at least the ones I could remember. And there are plenty of bad experiences that I've had that I don't think qualify as Yu-Gi-Oh horror stories, but that's the reason why they basically didn't make it onto this list. But who knows, I might make a separate series about them in the future. I also have many similar table flip situations like the one I told in part 2, but I didn't want to tell them since I feel like it would have been repetitive, so I told the one I thought was the worst. But let me know if you would like to hear more about similar situations like this in the future. And who knows, I might make a part 4 to my Yu-Gi-Oh horror stories in the future if I can remember another horrific situation, or if another horrific situation happens to me. And let me know what Yu-Gi-Oh horror stories you've had, or bad experiences you've had in general. But with that, that pretty much wraps it up for this video. If you would like to support more content like this in the future, you can do so at my Necromancer1040 Patreon link down below. I normally post it in the description, and you can check it there along with the other cool things I normally post down below. And with that, thank you so much for watching, thank you so much for your support, and I'll catch you in the next one. Alright, take care.